D.S. Walsh liked the quiet before it broke. The calm in the custody suite was the kind of silence that tasted of paperwork and cold coffee, of fluorescent lights, and the low hum of the holding cell radios. It gave her room to think, and to line up the knives of questions she would use on anyone foolish enough to stand in the way of the truth. She had a folder the thickness of a short novel on her desk. Statements, CCTV stills, bank transfers traced back to anonymous shell companies, witness notes with shaky handwriting and shaky memories. There were names in that folder that had become almost talismans of the case. Ray Walters and Celia Daniels above all. Their names printed in neat black letters until they seemed to blur into a smear of cruelty. Ray was dead, his body discovered in a shallow grave behind an abandoned haulage yard. Celia's whereabouts, however, remained a ragged, haunted question mark. The man who had been her partner in the racket had disappeared with enough of her to make their trail murkier than mud. "It's time to stop circling like vultures," Walsh told D.I. Keene as she pushed the folder toward him. "We go in where it hurts." Keene's face, usually stony, reflected a flicker of something like approval. "We've had a lot of smoke," he admitted. "We need a fire." The fire arrived in the form of a little bit of luck and a phone call from a man who had been paid to move other people's baggage. A local haulier, a wiry, nervous man named Tom Sykes who'd been using the same offline rent-a-storage unit for years, had gone into a unit to retrieve an old pallet he was sure he'd left there. Instead, he'd found a metal trunk, wedged behind broken shelves and the detritus of other people's lives. It was locked, and the padlock had been cut recently. Tom had thought nothing of it until the trunk had juddered when he shifted it, and a small bundle of papers had tumbled free. They were documents. Receipts. Names. A photograph. Police vehicles moved into the village like a slow, deliberate parade at dawn. For once, the locals were watching the arrival of officers with something resembling cautious hope rather than contempt. Word had rippled through the pub and the village shop. The police had found something. Paddy Kirk walked out of the vet's with a bag of prescriptions in his hand and his heart in his throat. His search for his missing father, Bear Wolf, had been an ache for months, a wound that nothing seemed to soothe. Every scrap of news about Ray and Celia had felt like a slap that reopened the wound. At the unit, Walsh's team worked with measured hunger. Technicians in gloves and masks sifted through the trunk's contents while uniformed officers held back a small crowd of residents who craned their necks over the barriers for a look. Inside the trunk were lists, ledger pages written in a tidy, almost clinical hand, shipping dates and names and amounts that suggested people had been moved and sold in ways that made Paddy's stomach turn. There was a business card for a manufacturing consultant, a booklet of foreign stamps, a phone with its screen smashed but its circuit board intact, and then, wrapped in greaseproof paper and almost ordinary, a silver lighter. Paddy knew that lighter. It was an old Zippo he'd given Bear on his 50th birthday, engraved on the side with the crude, affectionate scrawl, Paddy. He felt his knees go weak in a way that was part hope, part fear. The lighter could be evidence, proof that his father had been in that operation. Or it could be a cruel trick, something planted to keep him dangling on a thread. D.S. Walsh found him waiting just outside the cordon, breath clouding in the cold air. She had the kind of presence that cleared space. She didn't smile unless she meant it, and she didn't promise things she didn't intend to deliver. "Mr. Kirk," she asked. His voice, when he spoke, came out small and unsteady. "You found something?" he asked. Walsh put the lighter on the back of her gloved hand, so he could see it. Paddy leaned in as if to inhale proof. "It was in a trunk in a storage unit rented under Celia Daniels' name," Walsh said. "There were ledgers, transaction records, and a lot of material, correspondence, shipment schedules. We're treating it as material evidence of forced labor operations connected with Ray Walters and an associate we believe to be Celia. There are photographs, too. Some of them show people who I think can help us identify victims and possible sites." Hope made him dizzy for a second. "So, Bear, we've got links," Walsh said. "Not a body. Not a confession. But the lighter is there, and the handwriting on some of the logs matches a ledger already seized from one of Ray's premises. Celia's name was on the rental. We're treating her as a person of interest in relation to Ray's murder and numerous offenses. We need to find her." For the first time in months, Paddy felt the possibility of an answer wobble into being. He left the unit like a man with a new map, directions penciled into the folds of his mind. He ran to find Dylan Penders, who was still young enough to believe that hope could shift the weather. When Paddy burst through the door of the garage where Dylan worked on old vans, the younger man dropped his spanner and wiped grease on his trousers with a sound that was half laugh, half alarm. "You'll never guess," Patty said. He slapped the lighter into Dylan's palm, as if handing over something sacred. Dylan's eyes widened when he recognized the engraving. "This is," Dylan began, then stopped. "That's Bear's." "No way." Patty grinned in a helpless, sunlit way. D.S. Walsh says it's in a trunk rented to Celia. She's connected. They found ledgers and photos. Maybe this means. Maybe he's alive, Dylan finished. They hugged, two men with different kinds of fragility clutching at the idea of a return. But the hug was thin. Even as hope unfurled, it was laced with a thin strand of dread. Patty had learned to temper delight with caution. The village had been cruel in the months since Ray's crimes came to light. Moira Dingle had been dragged through the mud, her name smeared with accusations of trafficking because Robert Sugden had made sure the fingerprints were planted at her home. D.S. Walsh had been aggressive, surgical even, arresting where suspicion was strongest, interrogating with an intensity that made people falter. The police's hardball tactics had left a bitter taste for some. For Patty, they were a lifeline. Inside the unit, forensic technicians worked through the trunk like archaeologists. One of them, Lucy Cattry, called Walsh over with a small exclamation, the kind that came out of the mouse of her throat. "Look at this," Lucy said, pointing to a photograph. It was creased at the corners, the surface dimmed by time and an oily smear. A group of men in dirty overalls stood in the doorway of a warehouse. A narrow beam of light cut through the gloom and hit one of the men in the face. He wore a hat low over his brow. The stranger's jawline was familiar in a way that made Walsh's lips thin. "Enhance it," Walsh said to the tech. On the laptop, the image brightened under the software's ministrations, and the face in the shadow slid into focus. It wasn't a full portrait, only a partial profile. But the nose, the slope of the cheek, the stubborn set of the mouth, Walsh felt her chest tighten. She knew that face, Bear Wolf. She felt her professional alertness sharpen into something that approached compassion. "We need to run that against any CCTV we have from the last 6 months," she said. "We need to find that warehouse." The village hummed with the news. People congregated in corners of the pub and by the post office, exchanging fragments of the story like contraband. Suspicions shifted, alliances hardened. Moira's defense was a private, furious thing. She had wanted to scream the truth. That she'd been set up, that Robert had planted boxes and then lied to save his skin. But the police held their cards close and D.S. Walsh's case for urgency had won the day. If there was a person connected to those ledgers who might hold the key to the operations, they had to find them. A coordinated sweep began across the county. Warrants were served with efficient brutality at an address connected to a shipping line that had been used as cover for movement of laborers. 2 men were detained in a small terraced house on the edge of a light industrial estate. They were sullen, their eyes darting like trapped animals. It wasn't the end. It was a piece in a larger jigsaw. At the police station that evening, D.S. Walsh sat opposite Laurel Thomas and Jai Sharma, who had both been called in for questioning. Walsh's gaze flitted between them, soft when Laurel flinched and sharp when Jai's jaw tightened. "You have to understand," Walsh said. "We're not here to make false accusations. We want facts. We want to make sure that those who've been exploited get justice. But right now, people in the village are scared, and we need to know where Celia is. She's crucial." Laurel's pale face crumpled. "I tried to tell them," she whispered. "I tried to tell somebody. I didn't want this to happen. I thought Ray." Her voice broke and the room filled with a different kind of silence, grief. Beside Laurel, Jai looked like a man whose luck had run out. Walsh asked him about the ledger, the bank transfers. Jai admitted procedural ignorance at first, then stuttered into nervousness. "Ray handled things," he said finally. I thought I was just organizing shipments." Walsh's file filled with accounts of coercion. Victims began to surface. Men and women who had been brought in on the pretext of work, then held with threats and violence. D.S. Walsh prioritized their safety, moving them into protective custody and arranging support. Her team took statements in sterile rooms that smelled of lemon cleaner, and each story stitched a darker pattern. Celia as the organizer, Ray as the muscle, others named and number-tagged as complicit. But the photograph of Bear was a bright, stubborn pin in Walsh's notes. It motivated a small swerve of success that felt obscene. A delivery docket traced to a warehouse at the edge of a motorway. They found the building abandoned, its windows boarded and graffiti crawling like vines across the bricks. Inside, the smell of oil and old machinery was thick. There were signs of a makeshift living area in a back room. a foam mattress, a battered kettle, a pile of folded clothing. And in a corner, under a pallet, they found a worn baseball cap with a torn label, and next to it a scrap of paper with handwriting they'd seen in the trunk's ledgers. Blood tests, DNA, prints, the lab would do the work. But even in that near-empty warehouse, with dust motes spinning in the air like small galaxies, there was a sense of movement. Evidence that people had been there, that Bear's presence had been more than a photograph. Paddy sat with his hands wrapped around a mug that steamed and fogged up the window of his kitchen. He watched the garden as if the grass might give him up his father in some miraculous flash. For the first time since Bear vanished, he allowed himself to imagine a conversation. Bear in his old chair, grumbling about the kettle. Bear telling stories about youth and dogs and stubborn mistakes. But the village's narrative doesn't move in neat threads. It tangles. While the police were sewing up leads, other forces were at work. Robert Sugden, smart and slippery and desperate to keep his own name clean, continued to pull levers that would redirect suspicion toward Moira. The planted evidence in her house, boxes labeled with exports that were never dispatched, gave the tabloids a taste for outrage, and some of the village's voices, loud and greedy, began to cast their stones. Moira's children watched the headlines with a pained, exhausted look that made Paddy's chest hurt in a new way. D.S. Walsh did not care for the tabloids. She cared for facts. And her facts were stubborn. The ledger indicated payments labeled site upkeep and operational expenses. The phone records included calls to numbers registered under shell companies. One of the detained men finally cracked under careful, relentless interviewing. His story was a tangle of threats and bribes, but it included a name he'd heard spoken with fear and reverence, Celia. He described a woman who ran things with an even hand and a cold smile, a woman who kept both receipts and the people she forced into labor. Walsh listened with the kind of patience that is a weapon in itself. She assembled the testimony like an architect. Sheer walls of witness statements, supporting beams of bank transfers, the delicate plaster of a photograph. She started to see a map. The routes that Ray's operation had used, the safe houses, the warehouses, and the names that threaded through them. Celia's signature appeared on invoices and rental agreements. It was enough for a new warrant. Paddy followed every development with a somnolent need. He began to visit the police station in the smallest hours, hovering in the corridor while officers filed past. He would stand outside the interview rooms and listen to snippets that were not meant for him. Sometimes they were simply the hum of a radio, sometimes the low murmur of an officer on the phone promising another breath of optimism. Once, Walsh found him there and did not scold. She told him instead exactly what they had. "You have to be ready for anything, Paddy," she said gently. "This could go either way." He nodded. "If he's alive," he said, "I want to hold him." "And if he's not?" she asked. His voice was barely there. "Then I need to know." Walsh's face softened. "Then we'll keep looking." The raid they mounted at dawn on a set of rural units turned up more. A bathroom with chains welded to a beam, a cupboard with rationed tins, men who had not seen daylight in weeks, blinking in a way that looked like they were seeing color for the first time. A woman with hollow cheeks clutched her child and cried with the sound of someone who had overheard a miracle. The police led them into ambulances and vans with blankets and the promise of safety. In the cellar of one unit, behind a false wall, they found a small box of personal effects. A dog-eared postcard from Spain, a child's toy, a cigarette packet with a gravitationally sticky film of ash, and tucked inside, a scrap of fabric bearing a football club's crest. Someone recognized it on a photograph of Bear, standing outside the team's stadium. DNA on the fabric was being processed, but the connection felt like a hand clamped to a rope in the dark. Paddy traveled to the station with Dylan and two other friends. He walked through the corridors like a man approaching a chapel. When Walsh came out of the interview room, she handed him a sealed envelope that made his name in black ink look like a summons. Inside was a formal list of the items recovered. The lighter was there. So was the scrap of fabric. "You have to know," Walsh said, "that this could be circumstantial. But we're following it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emmerdale Echoes.